I just wrote a book called The Psychology of Secrets, and about secrets and authoritarianism, all that stuff. But one of the things I found was the kinds of people we think we tell our secrets to. We think we tell our secrets to polite people. And in actual fact, it's the opposite. We don't tell our secrets to polite people. We tell our secrets to assertive people. And that made me think about, what does polite mean? I guess it means just adhering to societal mores of a time and place. So if you were a polite Nazi, you would have said, hey, there's a Jew next door, let's get him. Or if you were a polite slaver, you would have just had lots of slaves or whatever. And one of the things I think you found is that women back up the moral order, which I think is another way of saying the politeness of a particular time.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so politeness is kind of a norm that involves suppression of speech. You know, if my mother-in-law has put on weight, which I'm not saying she has, but no, if she...
What's her name again?
But, you know, I think in terms of greasing the wheels of social interaction, it makes sense to not tell the truth, right? Sometimes, and not just say, oh, you put on weight. But I think the problem, so yeah, if we then move out into the public realm of science, for example, and saying, you know, do I think this person is a woman when they've got a beard? You know, am I allowed to say what I think? If you take that norm of, you know, the mother-in-law, that kind of private interaction norm, and you transpose it into the public realm, you're in big trouble, because you are now damaging what Jonathan Rauch calls the truth-based order of science, of law. And suddenly we're suppressing truth. And that's quite a dangerous problem. And there are a lot of these truths in academia, not a lot, but significant numbers of them. I mean, I mentioned the what is a woman one, but for example, history, and talking about history truthfully is suffering. I can give you the most egregious example in my book, of course, is the Canadian mass graves hoax, where it is still not possible in Canada for members of any of the mainstream parties to admit that there are no bodies, there were no children missing, in terms of documents, no parents looking for missing children. The whole thing is complete fabrication.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Because I think I spoke to Jonathan Kay about it. Do you know Jonathan Kay?
Yeah, Jonathan Kay.
I can't remember what side of it he's on, though.
Oh, he's definitely on my side on that. But I mean, but what I'd say is the problem is, because you have these knowledge keepers from the Indigenous, as well as their left-wing acolytes, white leftist acolytes, making these claims, the idea that you would say, that's a tall tale, right?
There was abuse, though, of the Indigenous Canadians at the schools, wasn't there?
Well, even there, yes, there was abuse, the way there was in other schools, in non-Indigenous or day schools on the reserves, or those who didn't go to school. So the abuse, I mean, you have to compare the abuse to other schools at the time in the 19th century, in the early 20th century. You have to compare the death rates, which essentially was almost all disease, tuberculosis deaths. Those deaths were actually considerably lower in the residential school system than they were in the schools on the reserve, or in the people who didn't go to school in the reserves. It's a very complicated picture. I mean, but there's been a huge amount of distortion of the truth on the entire residential schools picture. And there's not, the key is, it's not being approached in a fact-based way, based on forensic evidence, what you dig up, are there any bodies, or documentary evidence, are there parents that were looking for kids, that got their kids taken, that has to be done in a rational way, instead of just saying, hey, so-and-so said something, told a story. So there's this emphasis on the stories as trumping the forensic evidence, the documentary evidence. And that's what I mean, is that you don't want to offend a sacred group. You don't want to be mean. You always want to, be nice and polite. And that's what I mean. So when you have those politeness norms in the public sphere, then you sacrifice freedom, you sacrifice truth, and a whole bunch of other things. And so I don't even know when Canada's going to get out of that mess, because on the back of that, over 100 churches have been burned in retaliation because they're associated somehow with the residential schools. All these founding fathers of Canada have been, their statues have been torn down, Sir John A. Macdonald, because of everything's because of the residential schools, which is a whole house of cards, which rests on basically almost nothing. But it underpins the whole national identity is under assault because of essentially mostly myth. It's arguable that there's a nothing there. I mean, it's not that there weren't abuses, that took place, but abuses were taking place in non-Indigenous schools, right? There's no kind of objective, rational attempt to kind of come up with a storyline. And similarly, by the way, if we talk about Britain or the US on colonialism or slavery, you've got to say, okay, they did do slavery and colonialism. That was awful. Now let's just look at human history. Right?
Oh, yeah. Wow.
Is there any country that isn't built on stolen land? Like if you're going to say the US is built on stolen land, fine, true.
Yeah.
Is there any country that isn't built on stolen land? So if every country is built on stolen land, that is an important factor. Suddenly you can't feel as angry and emotional about this other instance of the same thing happening. Or slavery, again, same sort of thing, colonialism. It's not put in any kind of world historical context, so the emotions can run off the charts. And kids, so there's a question that I've asked and others have asked in surveys. If you ask, say, the native peoples of the United States lived in peace and harmony before the Europeans arrived. And you'll get a majority of people saying yes to that, especially progressives. The reality is that those societies were much bloodier, much more violent, engaged in slavery and conquest and genocide and all these sorts of things.
These progressives live in a cloud. They live in it's insane. They would think that humans have ever not been violent. I mean, Israel is another example. You've got, stolen land. That's why a lot of people consider it anti-Semitic to be anti-Zionist or to suggest that the Jews can't have their land. If you focus only on Israel being on what might be or stolen land or whatever, what about every other country in the world?